September 3rd, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. Unteroffizier Werner Krauss stepped off the transport truck into the late summer heat, his uniform still bearing the dust of North African battlefields where he had surrendered 4 months earlier. Around him, 450 German prisoners from Rommel's Afrika Korps stood in formation, waiting for what they had been conditioned to expect: brutal treatment, starvation rations, forced labor under inhuman conditions. Nazi propaganda had been explicit and unrelenting. American treatment of prisoners would be savage. Jews controlled America, and they would exact revenge on German soldiers. Prisoners would be starved, worked to death, denied basic human dignity. Every German soldier had heard these warnings. Many believed them completely. The camp commandant, Colonel Paul Arnett, addressed the assembled prisoners through a translator. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers. You will be housed in adequate facilities. You will be paid for labor performed. Tomorrow, many of you will be transported to local farms to assist with harvest operations. American agriculture is experiencing severe labor shortages due to the war." Krauss listened with profound skepticism. This was psychological warfare. The Americans were softening them before the real treatment began. No nation would feed enemy soldiers the same rations as their own troops. No country would pay prisoners for labor. This was manipulation designed to extract intelligence or break their will. What Krauss and his fellow prisoners could not comprehend was that the Americans were telling the literal truth. They were about to experience something that violated every assumption Nazi ideology had taught them about how enemies treated captives, about racial hierarchies, about the nature of American society itself. The next morning, Krauss and 30 other prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven 40 miles into the Texas countryside. They arrived at a cotton farm owned by James McKinley, a third-generation farmer whose 2 sons were serving in the army, one in North Africa, ironically fighting against the same forces these prisoners had belonged to. McKinley stood waiting as the guards escorted the prisoners into his barn. He was a large man, weathered by decades of agricultural work, wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed hat against the September sun. He looked at the German soldiers without apparent hostility, only assessment. "These boys know how to pick cotton?" McKinley asked the guard sergeant. "No, sir. Most are from industrial cities. Northern Germany." "Well, they're about to learn." McKinley turned to the prisoners. "I need 500 bales picked in the next 2 weeks. You work sunup to sundown, with breaks for water and lunch. You do the work properly, I'll make sure you're fed properly. Any questions?" The translator conveyed this to the prisoners. Krauss raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, what happens if we refuse to work?" McKinley looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Then you go back to camp and sit in a barracks all day. But you won't earn the 80 cents daily wage. Your choice." The prisoners exchanged confused glances. They were being offered a choice? They would be paid. This was not how Nazi propaganda had described American prisoner treatment. This was not how the Reich treated prisoners. Over the following days, Krauss experienced cognitive dissonance that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of everything he had believed about America, about Germany, about the nature of the war itself. The work was hard. Cotton picking under the Texas sun was brutal, physical labor that left muscles aching and hands bloodied from the sharp cotton bolls. But it was not punishment. It was simply work. Farm work that American civilians performed for wages. More significantly, the treatment was not what Nazi ideology had prepared them for. McKinley's wife brought lunch to the fields at midday, sandwiches with meat, fruit, cold water, sometimes pie, real food, abundant food, food that many prisoners had not seen since before the war began. "Why do they feed us so well?" Krauss asked Gefreiter Hans Müller, a fellow prisoner who had served in France before Africa. "We are enemies. We fought against their sons. Yet they give us American food." Müller had no answer. Neither did anyone else. The treatment violated the logical structure of warfare as they understood it. Enemies were supposed to hate you. Captors were supposed to exploit you. The Americans were doing neither. By the end of the first week, Krauss had picked 8 bales of cotton. His hands were calloused, his back ached, but he had earned $5.60, more money than he had possessed since his capture. More significantly, He had observed things that contradicted fundamental Nazi teachings. The farm employed workers of different races. White Americans worked alongside black Americans and Mexican migrant laborers. They ate lunch together. They joked together. They were paid the same wages for the same work. This racial integration was impossible, according to Nazi doctrine. Inferior races could not work alongside superior races as equals. Yet here it was, happening daily, functioning without apparent conflict or hierarchy beyond agricultural expertise. One afternoon, McKinley's truck broke down in the field. The farmer swore, kicked the tire, then looked at the assembled workers. "Anyone here know engines?" Krause stepped forward. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic in Hamburg. "I can look at it, sir." McKinley handed him tools without hesitation. Krause spent an hour diagnosing and repairing a fuel line problem. The truck started. McKinley nodded with satisfaction. "Good work. You just saved me $50 in repair costs and 3 days waiting for a mechanic from town. I'll make sure the guards know you're skilled labor. Might get you assigned to equipment maintenance instead of field work." Krause stood stunned. He had just helped his enemy. The enemy had thanked him and offered him better working conditions as reward. This was not warfare as he understood it. This was something else entirely. By late September 1943, over 3,000 German prisoners were working on farms across Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas. The program was expanding rapidly as American agriculture faced the worst labor shortage in modern history. Millions of American farm workers had been drafted. Migrant labor patterns had been disrupted. The 1943 harvest, critical for feeding American troops and allied nations, was at risk. The solution was to deploy prisoners of war for agricultural labor. Geneva Convention regulations permitted this. The program paid prisoners 80 cents per day, provided transportation, ensured adequate working conditions, and most significantly, created direct contact between German soldiers and American civilians. What American authorities had not anticipated was the profound psychological impact this contact would have on Nazi ideology. At the Schmidt farm in Nebraska, Obergefreiter Friedrich Weber worked alongside the farmer's 16-year-old son, teaching him proper wheat shocking techniques. The boy's older brother had died at Normandy 2 months earlier. Weber knew this. The entire family knew Weber was German, yet they treated him not as a murderer of American soldiers, but as a temporary farmhand performing necessary labor. "Don't you hate me?" Weber asked the boy one afternoon. "My countrymen killed your brother." The boy thought for a long moment. "Dad says hating you won't bring Tom back. Says the war is politicians' fault, not yours. Says you're just a soldier like Tom was, far from home, doing what you were told." This response was incomprehensible to Weber. Nazi ideology taught that Americans were weak, sentimental, incapable of the hardness necessary for warfare. Yet this boy, who had lost his brother to German bullets, was working alongside a German prisoner with apparent equanimity. This was not weakness. This was something Weber had no conceptual framework to understand. The food situation particularly shocked German prisoners. America was fighting a global war on 2 fronts. Yet agricultural abundance seemed unlimited. Prisoners working harvest operations witnessed wheat fields stretching to horizons, corn yields that exceeded anything German agriculture achieved, cattle ranches with thousands of head where German farms might have dozens. Stabsfeldwebel Otto Klein, a farmer from Bavaria before conscription, wrote in his secret diary, discovered decades later in American archives, "I worked German farmland for 20 years and never saw harvest like this. One American farm produces more wheat than my entire village district. They waste more grain in spillage than we rationed per family. The propaganda told us America was starving, that our U-boats had broken their supply. We were lied to. America has so much food they can feed prisoners better than German soldiers eat." The psychological demolition was systematic and devastating. Every interaction with American civilians contradicted Nazi teachings. Every meal proved German scarcity was not universal. Every dollar earned demonstrated that America could afford to pay enemy soldiers for agricultural labor during wartime. By October 1943, German prisoners working harvest operations had contributed to bringing in over 40 million bushels of wheat, corn, and other crops across the American Midwest. The labor was economically significant, replacing approximately 100,000 American farm workers who were serving in the military. But the strategic impact was psychological rather than economic. Camp newspapers written by prisoners began reflecting profound ideological confusion. Der Ruf, published at Camp Concordia, Kansas, evolved from defiant Nazi propaganda in June 1943 to questioning articles about democracy and free markets by December. The transformation came not from American propaganda, but from direct observation. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, a fervent Nazi Party member and Hitler Youth leader before the war, experienced complete ideological collapse while working at an Iowa farm. In a letter that passed American censors, who were monitoring precisely this kind of transformation, he wrote to his family, "We were told America was controlled by Jews who would torture us. I have met no Jews in Iowa. The farmers are Christians who treat us fairly. We were told Americans were weak and lazy. The farmers work harder than anyone I knew in Germany. We were told American agriculture was failing. I am harvesting more corn in 1 week than our village produced in a year. Everything we were told was lies. I don't know what to believe anymore." The American authorities recognized what was happening. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's Office, documented the phenomenon in classified reports. Major Edward Davison, monitoring the program, reported in November 1943, "Agricultural labor assignments are producing ideological transformation more effectively than any planned propaganda could achieve. Prisoners witness American abundance firsthand. They interact with civilians who show no hatred despite having sons fighting Germans. They eat food rationed in Germany but abundant here. They are paid wages for labor that in Germany would be forced. The cumulative impact is systematic destruction of Nazi worldview through simple exposure to American normalcy." Not all prisoners transformed immediately. Hardcore Nazi believers maintained that the treatment was psychological warfare, that abundance was staged, that kindness was manipulation. But even the most committed faced cognitive dissonance when confronted with daily evidence contradicting their ideology. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a Nazi Party member since 1934, maintained fierce loyalty to Hitler through his first month at Camp Trinidad, Colorado. He refused to work, delivered speeches about German superiority, intimidated other prisoners who showed interest in American culture. Then he was assigned to work at a ranch owned by William Harrison, whose son was fighting in Italy. Harrison needed help with cattle roundup before winter. The work was hard, dangerous, skilled labor that required horsemanship and cattle expertise. Richter, who had grown up on a small farm in East Prussia, possessed these skills. Over 3 weeks of working alongside Harrison and his remaining ranch hands, Richter's ideology began fracturing. Harrison treated him as a skilled laborer, asked his opinion on cattle management, shared meals without apparent concern that Richter was an enemy officer. The transformation came during a conversation around a campfire after a long day. Harrison asked Richter about his family, his life before the war, his hopes after the war ended. Simple questions that acknowledged Richter's humanity beyond his status as enemy. "Why do you treat me this way?" Richter finally asked. "Your son is fighting my countrymen. I would kill American soldiers if I were free. Yet you share food with me, pay me wages, treat me as a human." Harrison considered this. "My son is fighting for freedom. Part of freedom is treating people as individuals, not as categories. You're a prisoner now, not a soldier. You're doing honest work for honest wages. When the war ends, you'll go home to your family. I hope my son does the same. Hating you accomplishes nothing." This response shattered Richter's ideological framework. Nazi doctrine taught that strength came from hatred, that enemies were categories to be destroyed, that human dignity was conditional on racial and political hierarchy. Harrison's simple humanity, his refusal to hate, his acknowledgement of shared human experience, was more devastating to Nazi ideology than any propaganda could have been. By Christmas 1943, the transformation of German POWs working American farms had become systematic enough that American authorities began expanding the program. Over 50,000 German prisoners were deployed for agricultural labor. The economic contribution was significant, but the strategic value was in psychological transformation. Christmas 1943 itself provided the most profound demonstration of American treatment. Local communities across the Midwest organized Christmas celebrations for German prisoners. Church groups delivered gifts. Families invited small groups of prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most acceptances. Local Boy Scout troops made Christmas cards in German. At the Schneider farm in Minnesota, the family whose eldest son had died at Anzio 3 months earlier organized a Christmas dinner for the 5 German prisoners who had worked their harvest. The mother, Elizabeth Schneider, served traditional Christmas meal: turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pie, to the same nationality of soldiers who had killed her son. Unteroffizier Paul Fischer, one of the prisoners present, wrote in a letter, "I cannot comprehend this kindness. We killed her son, yet she feeds us better than German officers eat. She gives us presents. She shows no hatred. This is not weakness. This is strength we never understood. A nation secure enough in its power to show mercy to enemies. A people confident enough in their values to demonstrate them rather than merely proclaim them." The harvest program continued through 1944 and into 1945. German prisoners brought in cotton, wheat, corn, sugar beets, vegetables and fruit across the American agricultural belt. They witnessed the full scale of American abundance, not just food, but infrastructure, mechanization, electricity, wealth distributed across rural populations in ways that German rural communities had never experienced. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a Nebraska farm, documented his observations. Every farmhouse has electricity. Every farmer owns a tractor, sometimes 2. They have automobiles for personal use. Their workers, including Negroes, are paid wages that would make German skilled laborers wealthy. They complain about rationing that gives them more food than German civilians see. This abundance is not propaganda, it is reality we cannot deny. The culmination of the agricultural labor program came in autumn 1944, when prisoners helped bring in the largest American wheat harvest in history, over 1.1 billion bushels. German POWs contributed an estimated 10% of this total. The labor that Nazi propaganda had promised would be brutal exploitation, instead became an economic and psychological transformation. By early 1945, with Germany collapsing and the war's end imminent, many German prisoners expressed reluctance to return home. They had witnessed prosperity in America, while letters from Germany described starvation, destruction, and collapse. They had experienced treatment as human beings, while reports from home described Nazi party officials executing deserters and shooting civilians for defeatism. The American agricultural experience had provided German POWs with something more valuable than wages or food. It had provided them with evidence that an alternative to Nazi ideology existed and functioned successfully. That democratic societies could be strong, that diversity could be productive, that treating people with dignity could coexist with military power. When repatriation began in 1945 to 1946, over 371,000 German POWs returned to Germany, carrying memories of American farms, American abundance, American humanity. Many would become leaders in West Germany's reconstruction, bringing with them agricultural techniques, democratic principles, and economic philosophies learned during their captivity. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Hearn, who worked Texas cotton farms, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who worked Nebraska wheat fields, became president of the European Commission. They brought American methods to German reconstruction because they had witnessed those methods functioning during their imprisonment. The agricultural labor program had accomplished something no military victory could achieve. It had demonstrated through direct experience that everything Nazi ideology taught about America was false. That abundance came from freedom, not conquest. That diversity created strength rather than weakness. That treating workers fairly increased production rather than decreased it. That human dignity and military power were compatible rather than contradictory. In 1985, at a reunion of former German POWs in Austin, Texas, over 500 veterans returned to America, many bringing their families to show them the farms where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had worked Iowa farms and later became a physician in Germany, spoke at the reunion. "We came to America as enemies, as believers in Nazi ideology, as soldiers who expected brutal treatment. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had witnessed an alternative way of living. American farmers treated us not as enemies, but as workers. They paid us fair wages, fed us adequately, showed us respect. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, this changed us forever. We returned to Germany with a mission, to build a society based on what we witnessed in American fields, rather than what we experienced in Nazi Germany." The agricultural labor program demonstrated a profound truth that military strategists often overlook. The most powerful weapon in defeating an ideology is not military force, but simple demonstration of a superior alternative. German POWs witnessed American prosperity, experienced American fairness, and learned that democratic societies could accomplish what Nazi ideology claimed only totalitarianism could achieve.